Hey everybody, and welcome back to Submarine History. Today, we're going to talk about the German Type XXI U-boat, or electro boat, that Germany hoped would turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic back in their favor. I'll cover the basic specifications for the boat and a few of its innovative technical aspects today. In the future, I'll do a series of deep dives on the technologies built into the boat. So today is more about the background events going on that made this boat necessary and how the Germans got it into production. Read the description to this briefing. It has relevant related references and links. I have a Discord as well, and there's an invitation link on the channel banner. If you like the briefing, you can leave a super thanks or consider a channel membership. Your donation helps offset the cost of purchasing books, professional memberships, and software needed to write and record the briefings you've come to enjoy and appreciate it. Finally, thank you to the United States Naval Institute for all they do preserving and promoting world naval history. Black May. In May 1943, Germany lost 43 U-boats versus 58 Allied ships sunk. I have withdrawn from the North Atlantic to the area west of the Azores in the hope of encountering less air reconnaissance there. That's the Commander-in-Chief Navy, Karl Dönitz, minutes of the conference of the Commander-in-Chief Navy with the Fuehrer on May 31st, 1943 at the Berghof. It's commonly assumed that Black May marked the beginning of the end of the U-boat's reign in the Battle of the Atlantic. Or is it? Let's take a closer look at this. This is a chart I put together based on data over at uboat.net. This is the timeline for the European War, and on it we have two lines. A gray line, which represents the average number of U-boats at sea in any given month, and a yellow line, which represents the ratio of merchant shipping sunk to the number of U-boats sunk in a given month. Just look at those lines for a moment. When that yellow line is up high, it tells us we're sinking a lot of ships relative to the number of U-boats we're losing in a given month, so we're efficient. When that yellow line is really low, it tells us that we're losing a lot of U-boats relative to the number of ships we're sinking, which is inefficient. Let's take a different look at the data. Same chart, but I've put two red boxes on it, representing the first happy time, which ran from approximately July 1940 to March 1941, and represents U-boat effectiveness against convoys in the North Atlantic. Then there's the second happy time. That's Operation Drumbeat, U-boat operations off the U.S. Eastern Seaboard. And that runs from about January to July 1942. Now, what do you notice about the chart? We can see that during the first happy time, U-boats truly were efficient. They had a high ship-to-U-boat loss ratio, and they were doing that with very few U-boats at sea. Now, on the surface, the second happy time also looks very productive. The ship-to-U-boat loss ratio is good during this time, but it's not quite as good as during the first happy time. Furthermore, we have a lot more U-boats out at sea during the second happy time, so we're not as efficient as we once were. That second happy time represents the U.S. not being prepared for their entrance into the war. But we can see that by July of 1942, the U.S. had tightened things up regarding anti-submarine warfare and convoy efforts. If we take out those shipping losses during the second happy time, you'd see a pretty flat line because things would not have changed with the British in the North Atlantic. So this chart shows us that over time, the U-boat effectiveness is going down. But it doesn't answer the question, why was the effectiveness going down? Let's look at this chart one more time a little differently. Alrighty, on this chart we have two lines. Green is the ship-to-U-boat loss ratio, and the orange line is the ship-to-fleet boat loss ratio. So we're going to compare U-boat to fleet boat performance. Oh, and so we're clear, when I say fleet boat, I'm referring to U.S. submarines operating in the Pacific against the Japanese. And the time period we're going to compare is from the entrance of the U.S. into the war in December 41 until May 45 when Germany surrendered. See how the ship-to-U-boat ratio starts to go down after the end of the second happy time and basically flatlines permanently in 1943? That ratio gets so low, you actually have months where multiple U-boats are actually being lost per merchant ship sunk. and we've had a lot of U-boats at sea starting December 1941. Now, what about this ship-to-fleet boat ratio? Not so great from the start of the war to about the fall of 1943. But then the U.S. fixes the Mark 14 torpedo problem, and look what happens. Boom! Big jump in ship-to-fleet boat loss ratio. Now, don't get me wrong. U.S. submarines did have months where combat performance was okay earlier in the war, but it's not great like it is after the Mark 14 torpedo problems are addressed. So if the fleet boats are rocking around November 1943, why does that ratio suddenly go down and kind of flatline starting October of 44? Well, in the case of U.S. fleet boats, they pretty much ran out of Japanese merchant shipping to sink. Keep in mind that for every merchant ship sunk by a fleet boat, Army and Navy aviation were sinking 1 to 2 merchant ships as well. So that 12-month period was really productive for the U.S., and it broke the back of Japanese merchant shipping. Now here's a what if. What if the Mark 14 torpedo worked correctly from the start of the war? How would have that changed the graph? So the answer to that is that happy time for U.S. fleet boats, that would have moved way to the left, like near the start of the war. But it would still eventually flatline. It would flatline either because you ran out of targets or the Japanese tightened up their anti-submarine warfare efforts. Probably a little bit of both. Now, Japanese anti-submarine warfare, and this is from what little reading I've done on the subject to date, their ASW was pretty basic compared to the Allies. And it doesn't seem likely that they really invested in anti-submarine warfare until well after the Mark 14 was fixed, and by then it was too late. If fleet boats had been successful from the start of the war, it would have forced the Japanese to adapt and improve anti-submarine warfare right from the start and quickly. And this would have resulted in more fleet boats being lost while the Japanese preserved more of their merchant fleet, at least until the U.S. fleet caught up. All right, so anyways, so now, is that the reason the ship-to-U-boat ratio flatlined? Because U-boats ran out of shipping to sink? No, of course not. The U.S. was pumping out merchant ships at an incredible rate, and those ships were being protected in convoys by a combined team of experienced Allied surface and air anti-submarine warfare assets. That flatline suggests that, in spite of the number of U-boats at sea, they're not having much, if any, success. The takeaway from all this is that U-boats lost the initiative and effectiveness starting at least around July 42, or almost a year before Black May. You know who else noticed this trend? Yep, this guy, Admiral Karl Durit, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboots, or BDU, or Supreme Commander of Submarines, Kriegsmarine. Durit, he had been running the numbers and saw in the summer of 42, despite the U-boat success off the U.S. eastern seaboard, the numbers were trending down long term. So concerning was the data, Durit traveled from Paris, where U-boat command had relocated, to Berlin for a meeting with Grand Admiral Erich on September 28, 1942, to discuss progress in the development of the Walter boats and a new generation of torpedoes. Durit told Raeder during the meeting that radar detectors on U-boats had made it possible for them to evade Allied aircraft and surface forces, but it wasn't enough. Even though U-boats could detect Allied radar, that radar still kept the U-boats at bay, and they were unable to make their nighttime surface convoy attacks from close distance. Durit did not think ASDIC had progressed significantly, and he thought high underwater speed and endurance could make it possible for U-boats to get past an escort screen undetected and into the heart of a convoy. As far as 5,000 meters out from a target, that high-speed U-boat would use a combination of hydrophones and active sonar to approximate a target's course, speed, and distance. A periscope could briefly be used to confirm the angle on bow. All that information would then be fed into the targeting computer to program and launch pattern-searching torpedoes from as deep as 50 meters. High speed and underwater endurance would make it possible for U-boats to get inside an escort screen to attack the convoy and then stay under and keep pace with that convoy while torpedoes were reloaded and the attack resumed. That high speed and underwater endurance would also make it possible for U-boats to slip away from attacking anti-submarine warfare escorts, which were slower vessels and had to operate at slow speeds to use ASDIC effectively. This is why Durit was pressing radar to make Walter boat development a priority. What were these Walter boats Durit was talking about? Well, this is Helmuth Walter. He was a German engineer who did pioneering research in things like rocket engines, gas turbines, and air-independent propulsion systems for submarines. He had been working on the idea of an air-independent propulsion system for U-boats as early as 1933. An air-independent propulsion system would allow a U-boat to be propelled underwater by a powerful thermal engine without the need for drawing air in from the surface. Through AIP and a hull streamlined for underwater efficiency, it would be possible for U-boats to achieve underwater speeds in excess of 24 knots. Walter and his team of engineers had a kind of skunk works, where his company worked to develop a series of prototype submarines to test the feasibility of AIP, with the goal of getting contracts to develop one or more classes of U-boats for the Kriegsmarine. We'll do a separate briefing series on those Walter boats. All right, back to Durit and Raeder. Raeder, he thought the issues raised were important enough to arrange a meeting with Hitler, who was available on that day and was briefed. Hitler assured Durit that Walter boat and torpedo programs would receive the highest priority from that point on. As a stopgap measure, it was suggested during the meeting the possibility of making use of one of the streamlined hulls being developed by Walter. It could be modified using a figure-8 pressure hull to store twice the number of batteries existing U-boats had. That would allow a conventional diesel-electric submarine drive to achieve much higher underwater speeds, plus the endurance needed to make that speed useful. It was also suggested at the time the use of a breathing pipe or snorkel to allow the boat to remain underwater for long periods of time. After Hitler approved the priority of the Walter boat development, it was necessary to assess the progress that had been made on these experimental boats. This took a couple months, and by November 1942, a team of construction experts determined that the Walter AIP technology was still a ways off from reaching the full-scale production stage. In January of 1943, Deutsche Werk received a contract to build two Type 18 Walter boats, the U-796 and 797, and that's a profile of the Type 18 there shown on the slide. Tank studies had shown that the streamlined hull for the Type 18 could achieve a top surface speed of 18.5 knots and a submerged speed of 24 knots. Walter and Deutsche Works were a couple months into the detailed design of the Type 18 when Durit visited Walter on March 2, 1943. He came to discuss the progress that Walter's team had made on their boats since the previous November, and Walter had to be honest and tell him full-scale production of the boats like this was still a long way off. However, Walter's team brought up the idea of taking the streamlined hull of the Type 18 and adapting it to a conventional diesel-electric drive arrangement, as had been suggested the previous September. By using a figure-8 hull, it was thought battery capacity could actually be increased 3 times of the U-boats currently in service. The combination of that diesel-electric drive arrangement with a large battery capacity and the Type 18 streamlined hull would get you close to the speed and endurance performance of an AIP drive. And by April 1943, Durit had greenlit an evaluation of converting the Type 18, and the Type 21 project itself was greenlit on June 29, 1943. Side note, it was also at this meeting when Walter brought up the idea of incorporating snorkels into the existing U-boats, which Durit agreed would be valuable and authorized the retrofitting of them into existing U-boats as soon as possible, and we did a briefing on that. And here it is, the Type 21 electro boat. Before we go over the specs for the boat, let's look at a few more pictures. This is the Willem Bauer U-2540. It was scuttled at the end of the war, but it was raised in 1957, refurbished, and began service with the West German Bundesmarine in 1960. It served until 1983 and today is a museum ship at the Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven, Germany. Good high-quality imagery for these boats is pretty hard to find, so it's really a treasure to have a Type 21 as a museum boat. After Durit greenlit the project in June of 1943, design work begins in July, and within 4 months they had the design complete, or enough of it complete, that orders could be placed in November. And here we have a 360-degree view of the Type 21. This is from World of Warships. Sorry about the Azur Lane port, but it's really only one of 2 ports where you can see the entire hull, and the lighting is better in this port. The first 2 boats, the U-2501 and U-3001, were ordered November 6, 1943. The U-2501 was laid down on April 3, 1944, launched May 12, 1944, and commissioned June 27, 1944. The U-3001 was laid down on April 15, 1944, launched May 30, 1944, and commissioned July 20, 1944. How is it possible these boats were launched in like 6 weeks? Typically, a Type 9 would take 11 months from laying down the keel to launching. Dr. Albert Speer, he's the Minister of Armaments and War Production. He comes into the picture around July 1943 and is tasked with accelerating and streamlining production of the Type 21 U-boat. His staff had been critical of traditional U-boat construction methods, and they proposed something radical: the construction of a U-boat hull in modules in a distributed fashion that can be brought together at the shipyards and quickly assembled. And this strategy was taken to reduce the effects of Allied bombing on German industrial centers. That's an advantage, but there were also some disadvantages with this strategy. A significant disadvantage was the need to train workers and companies maybe not normally associated with submarine construction or any type of shipbuilding in this type of complex work. Because of Speer's involvement in the project, it was possible to build the hull modules, deliver them to the shipyards, and assemble the boats in about 6 months, or 5 months faster than the typical Type 9 boat. Here is a typical hull module for the Type 21. First off, I'll apologize for terrible highlighting on the photo to the right. Kind of why I included the unmarked version to the left. This is one of 2 modules for crew accommodations. On the left, you can see how we have a large circular section stacked on top of a smaller circular section. It's an asymmetrical figure 8. You can see how this figure 8 pressure hull, and this is the right photograph. The figure 8 pressure hull is the yellow highlight, and it's wrapped inside an outer hull that's streamlined in red. There are 3 decks in this section, and I have the decks marked in yellow. The top deck was crew accommodations, and the lower 2 decks were for batteries. That space between the pressure hull and the outer hull was free flooding, so water could flow into it when the boat dived. That space was used to accommodate a variety of hydraulic lines and components, diving tanks, fuel bunkers, and other gear. People will ask, why didn't Germany just do a guppy conversion to the existing Type 7 and Type 9 boats? You'll get different answers like, yeah, sure it could be done, or you could do it, but it would take too many U-boats out of service for conversions, or it would take 6 to 12 months to convert a given U-boat, and that's too long. So those are good points, but they're not the reason Germany didn't do that kind of guppy conversion to existing boats. The reason existing U-boats weren't streamlined is that streamlining the hull to afford a high underwater speed was only half the equation. This figure 8 pressure hull arrangement is really what made the Type 21 special. It made it special because the pressure hull configuration made it possible to triple the number of battery cells in it versus a Type 9 U-boat. You had 124 individual battery cells on a Type 9, divided between 2 battery divisions. 62 cells per division. The Type 21 had 372 individual battery cells divided between 6 battery divisions, each division having 62 cells. All those extra batteries would make it possible for the Type 21 to operate at a high underwater speed for a long enough time to make that speed useful. And we'll talk about this here on the next slide. Okay, and here we have a table with some basic specifications for the Type 21. I'll just read through this real quick. Our construction, it's a double hull, 7 watertight compartments, the hull being built from 8 prefabricated sections or modules. Displacement, 1,621 surfaced, 1,819 tons submerged. Dimensions, it had almost 77 meters overall in length, 11 meters high, and 6.3 meters draft. Propulsion, the main diesel drive, there were 2 6-cylinder 4-stroke supercharged diesels for 4,000 total horsepower. There was a main E-motor installation, and that provided 5,000 total horsepower. And then there was also a second E-motor for low-speed travel or crawling, and that provided 226 horsepower total. So this is interesting. We're looking at this, and we already know we have more power available underwater than we do on the surface. And that's reflected here. Top maximum surface speed is 15.6 knots. Maximum submerged speed is 7.2 knots with the main E-motor and 6.1 knots with the crawling E-motor. Range, 15,500 at 10 knots, down to 5,100 nautical miles at 15.6 knots. Submerged. This is where it gets interesting. 340 nautical miles at 5 knots, 110 nautical miles at 10 knots, or 30 nautical miles at 15 knots. So that 340 nautical miles at 5 knots, okay, that represents a potential 68-hour underwater endurance. And see that 110 divided by 10, that represents, 11-hour underwater endurance. And then 2 hours at 15 knots. That being able to travel 10 knots underwater for 10 hours, that's really powerful. That's really powerful. That conventional U-boats did not have that option. Let's see here. Depth data. Diving depth is 100 meters. The test depth is 150 meters, and the crush depth is 240 meters. Now, and we're going to talk about this in a second, but after the war, each of the Allied countries got a couple of these Type 21s to examine and stuff. So when the U.S., they had 2 boats, and one of the boats that they were doing running tests on and trials and stuff, it was the U-25, formerly the U-25-13. But it was reported in an interview with one of the U.S. servicemen who served on that boat after the war, that they actually cracked the pressure hull at 750 feet, which is pretty close to that crush depth of predicted crush depth of 240 meters. And I think what's interesting about that is that the crew felt like that boat had the ability to go a lot deeper than 750 feet, and they attributed the premature cracking of the hull to poor workmanship. And that relates back to just because they were just trying to knock these boats out so fast, your quality assurance starts to slip. Let's see, armament: 6 torpedo tubes with 23 torpedoes or 66 mines, and then twin 20 or 30 millimeter AA guns. One of the many innovations with the Type 21 was the automatic torpedo reloading system. This system made it possible to do an initial reload of all 6 bow tubes in about 10 minutes. The second complete reload would take about 30 minutes. Now on a Type 9, it took about 30 minutes to reload a single tube and about 3 hours to do all 4 bow tubes. This automatic reloading system solved a problem for existing U-boats, having to withdraw from action to reload the tubes, then trying to catch up to the convoy again. With the Type 21, you could keep pace with and stay under the convoy, where you could hide in the convoy's noise and quickly reload. Let's compare some of the stats to the Type 9 and the U.S. Gato fleet boat. And, if you want to pause this slide and just kind of study the numbers, yeah, feel free to do that. I'm just going to talk through them. The 2 columns on the right, mostly. Our max surface speed and submerged speed. So for the Type 9, surface is 18.3. Submerged is 7.3. For the Type 21, top surface speed is 15.6, and the submerged max speed is 17.2. With the Gato, the max surface speed is 21, and the maximum submerged speed is 9. So here's the thing. Really, with the Type 1, normally you would never even travel on the surface. There wouldn't be a reason for it because you did have the snorkel. So you would actually be able. So you actually had access to more speed on a regular basis underwater than by far and away than either the Type 9 or the Gatos. And then there's some range data, and we can see that with the Type 9s, let's see, 128 knots underwater divided by 2. So that implies a underwater endurance of up to 64 hours. And we went over these submerged distance numbers and speeds on the Type 21. The Gato, 96 nautical miles underwater at 2 knots. So that suggests an underwater endurance of 48 hours. So how do these speeds compare to the typical opponent a Type 21 would face? A Flower-class corvette has a top speed of about 16 knots, and a Black Swan-class sloop 20 knots, and a Buckley-class destroyer escort 24 knots. A Type 21 could outrun some of the escorts flat out, and it was fast enough that faster escorts would have trouble catching up before a Type 21 could slip away down into the depths to hide. The British had developed a crawling attack method where one escort used ASDEC to locate a U-boat and then directed another escort to attack. This required the directing escort to be almost stationary while the second escort slowly, quietly so as not to alert the U-boat, moved into a position to drop depth charges. It was an effective method because U-boats were so slow underwater. But with the Type 21, it's long gone before the escorts can even get into a position to start tracking the U-boat. Because of the distributed nature of the Type 21 construction process, it was necessary for the centers of module construction to communicate with each other. This was done over radio with Enigma encrypted messages because of damage to the telephone network within Germany. Not surprisingly, this afforded the British the opportunity to eavesdrop on German communications related to Type 21 production. Using this information gained from decrypted messages, the British began conducting photo reconnaissance missions to monitor the Blohm and Voss and Deschamag AG Vesser shipyards. These were the yards that were assembling the Type 21. They also flew photo missions into the interior of Germany to identify where the centers of module construction were located, even identifying specific production buildings. The Germans were also transferring over to Japanese resources in Berlin technical details about the Type 21. Those Japanese sources in turn transmitted that technical information back to Japan over radio, which gave the British another opportunity to gather information about the Type 21 program. Now, this information alarmed the British because they understood the implications of that high underwater speed and endurance. They realized existing strategies to combat U-boats would be ineffective once these boats entered service. It was a lot of speculation on the part of the British, so they needed real answers. To do this, they would convert one of their own submarines, the HMF Seraph, and that's an S-class submarine, and then they tried to duplicate the performance of the Type 21. This boat was chosen because it already had a streamlined hull, and the British knew it had a weak sonar signature, and we'll see this on the next slide. They reduced the crew side and removed as much gear and equipment as possible, and then they stuffed the interior with extra batteries until they could get a submerged speed of 12 knots. Having done this, they ran tests against experienced ASDEC operators to see if they could detect Seraph. And the test determined that well-trained crews working together could detect and counter Seraph, even if they weren't using the latest gear. So let's go over some of these findings by the British, some of the recommendations from the SARF or SARF, not sure the pronunciation, sorry, tests. Okay. Improve sonar buoy supplying techniques. Use them after a U-boat has fired torpedoes and is making its escape to track it. Add more escorts with ASDEC to convoys so they may be brought together quicker and work close together. modify night-capable Liberator squadrons to extend their patrol time, even at the expense of carrying fewer weapons. Improve techniques to find U-boats lying on the bottom in shallow water. Expect anti-submarine warfare forces to be spread out over larger areas to find U-boats operating at high speed. And these recommendations should be developed so that they are effective against conventional U-boats as well, as initially it's expected that these new electro boats will operate with conventional U-boats when attacking. So you listen to that, and what you get from that is basically a lot of hopium. Now, we'll never know if the Type 21 would have been successful because the war ended before they were available in numbers to make an impact. 118 Type 21 U-boats were commissioned during the war. Only 2 boats, the U-2511 and U-3008, would each make a single combat patrol before the end of the war, without any ships sunk. The boats were so complex and the construction so spotty, it just took a lot longer to get these boats through trials and crew training. People ask, could the Type 21 have turned the tide? The answer is no, but not because the Type 21 itself wasn't capable. It absolutely was, and with time, its problems would have been worked out and the crews trained to make the boat successful. But it wasn't enough for the Type 21 itself to be successful. The problem facing the Germans was that, unlike the US or British, the Kriegsmarine was never really a navy capable of combined operations, meaning the US and British had navies with integrated air, surface, and subsurface components working together to achieve mission goals. And the Germans didn't have that. They never had an effective and meaningful naval air component, and by the end of 1943, it was reduced down to mostly a fleet of submarines and coastal defense ships. So the US and British were free to concentrate on just one problem, U-boats, and those U-boats didn't have an air or surface arm to work with or support them. Additionally, the industrial capacity of the United States was so great, it could just come over any measure of success U-boats had. What then is the legacy of the Type 21 U-boat? Well, after the end of the war, the Allies divvied up some of the better Type 1 examples, and they spent considerable time studying and operating the boats. The information gained from these studies was used by each Allied nation to develop their own version of the electro boat. So this is how we know the Type 21 was successful. The fact that every nation that had a chance to study and operate the boats realized that, this is the way to go forward. This is a Russian Whiskey class boat, which began production in the early 1950s and was heavily influenced by the Type 21. Here's another look at the Whiskey, and it is remarkable how much it looks like the Type 21. Another example here, this is the Russian Zulu class boat, also produced in the 1950s and heavily influenced by the Type 21. And then we have an example of a U.S. boat. This is the SS Klamagor, SS 343, that had gone through the Guppy program after the war. The goal of the Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program, Guppy, was to incorporate as much technology from the Type 21 into existing boats while a new generation of streamlined diesel-electric boats were being developed. So today, there are diesel-electric submarines still operated by nations around the world, and their design and performance specs are often not that far off from what the Type 21 offered. Now, the submarines that we've talked about in today's briefing, the German Type 21, the British S-class, the Russian Whiskey class, and the U.S. Balao class, these boats are all available to play in World of Warships. And of course, the Type 21 is available to play in the Silent Hunter game series. And that's it for today's briefing. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave your questions and comments below. Come on over to the Submarine History Discord and say hi. Till next time, peace out.